Welcome to The Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here today. So, let's just jump straight into this, because today we're taking a really fascinating journey across time. We're going to deconstruct one of the most captivating concepts in all of human history, which is, how did ancient and medieval rulers build empires that literally outlasted them by centuries or even millennia? Whether we're talking about the crushing physical weight of stone monuments out in the desert, or the sort of invisible weight of the crown, we're looking at the actual blueprints of power.
And to really get into this, we have to start with a question that honestly still absolutely baffles historians and engineers today. How on earth do you build a lasting empire when you have zero modern machinery, no advanced infrastructure, no digital tech, nothing? It is the ultimate historical mystery, and it's perfectly embodied by the ancient pyramids of Giza. Just try to imagine coordinating an entire society to build something so permanent with literally nothing but raw human labor and ingenuity. No way, right? But they did it.
Just think about the sheer contrast we're looking at here. On one side, you have the Egyptian pyramids. That represents a staggering 6 million tons of physical stone. It is authority made completely solid, immovable, and eternal. But then, on the other side, we have the British monarchy, representing over 1,000 years of continuous institutional rule. And that's a totally different kind of architecture altogether. It's an architecture built out of laws, bloodlines, and societal structures. So today, we're going to explore how both of these things, physical stone and invisible institutions, actually serve the exact same purpose, cementing absolute authority.
Okay, so here is our roadmap for today. First, foundations of power. Second, architecture of authority. And third, forging enduring legacies. Let's get right into it.
Part 1, Foundations of Power.
6 million. I really want you to just let that number sink in for a second. The Great Pyramids are made up of roughly 6 million tons of stone. To put that into perspective, it just brilliantly captures the completely impossible scale of ancient physical power. And remember, they pulled this off in an era with no cranes, no diesel engines, no structural steel. So the foundation of power here was strictly a ruler's ability to mobilize and sustain a massive workforce. The pyramid isn't just a tomb. No, it's basically a giant 6 million ton billboard advertising the absolute, unquestionable authority of the pharaoh.
But you know, foundations don't always have to be made of stone. Over in Britain, the foundation of a 1,000-year monarchy was literally forged in blood and warfare. If we look at the timeline, back in 802 AD, Egbert III started uniting the chaotic, constantly warring Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex. Fast forward to 871 AD, and you have Alfred the Great fighting off these fierce Danish invasions, barely pulling his kingdom back from the absolute brink of collapse. And then finally, by 927 AD, Athelstan achieves what seemed completely impossible. He unites the realms and becomes the first true king of England. So they didn't build pyramids, right? Instead, they hammered these fractured, warring kingdoms into a single, unified foundation.
So, the absolutely crucial takeaway here is how the method of securing power evolves over time. We're moving from the physical stone of Giza to the invisible, but honestly just as heavy, force of laws and treaties. When Alfred the Great defeated the Danish Vikings, he didn't just build walls to keep them out. He established Danelaw. He basically divided the realm right down the middle. Saxons rule the south and east, and Danes get the north and west. And why does this matter to us? Because Alfred realized that if you want a lasting foundation, sometimes you need compromise in institutional boundaries, not just brute force. Adaptability literally became the cornerstone of his empire.
Which brings us to Part 2, Architecture of Authority.
So, rulers pretty quickly figured out that physical might wasn't always going to be enough to keep people in line. You needed the heavens on your side too. Edward the Confessor, who ruled right before things got totally chaotic in 1066, built Westminster Abbey. And listen, this wasn't just him building a beautiful church. This was a highly calculated architectural move. By establishing the abbey, he permanently intertwined the divine authority of the church with the earthly political power of the crown. It was an architecture of the mind and spirit, basically making it so that any rebellion against the king was now synonymous with a rebellion against God himself. Pretty smart, right?
But then again, sometimes you really do just need brute force. 500. When William the Conqueror successfully invaded England in 1066, he didn't exactly politely ask for everyone's submission. To enforce his new Norman rule over a very hostile Anglo-Saxon population, he built an estimated 500 motte and bailey castles across the countryside, and he did that in just 20 years. That pace of construction is just breathtaking. These castles served as a constant, physically looming reminder to the locals that, hey, a new, pretty brutal authority is officially in charge.
William definitely didn't stop at just physical castles, though. He essentially built an architecture of data with the Doomsday Book. Keep in mind, this is a time way before computers. before widespread literacy even. Yet William commissions this hyper-detailed survey of everything. I mean everything. Every field, every pig, every plow in England. It was a totally unprecedented tool for strict tax collection and administrative control, and it brilliantly illustrates a timeless rule. True dominion requires knowing exactly what your subjects own so you can tax them for it. Information, even way back in the 11th century, was the ultimate power.
Over time, though, this architecture had to bend, or it was literally going to break. Initially, under an absolute monarchy, the king's word was unquestioned law. But by 1215, you have incompetent rulers like King John pushing the nobility just way too far, and that results in the Magna Carta. For the very first time, the crown itself was placed under the rule of law, a huge shift. And later on, we see the creation of the first parliament under Simon de Montfort. So the architecture of authority was shifting, right? It was moving away from this rigid top-down pyramid structure and turning into a much more complex web of representation and legal checks.
And then, out of nowhere, nature itself comes in and totally restructures the architecture of society. In one of the most horrific events in human history, the Black Death of 1348, up to half of the European population perished. Half. But what you should really take away from this tragedy is the unintended economic consequence. With so few workers left alive, the surviving peasants suddenly had massive leverage. It essentially broke the feudal system of serfdom overnight. Landowners actually had to start paying for free laborers, so totally restructured the economic architecture of the realm from the ground up.
All right, moving on to Part 3, Forging Enduring Legacies.
So let's look at King Edward I, also famously known as Edward Longshanks. Now, he was a fierce warrior, for sure, but his truest legacy was actually building institutional pillars that have lasted for centuries. He didn't just go around fighting wars, he fundamentally structured society. He clarified the courts. You had the King's Bench for criminal cases, the Exchequer handling finance, and common pleas for daily civil disputes. He even fostered the Inns of Court, which basically created the modern legal profession independent of the church. These are invisible monuments, but they are monuments that literally still govern our lives today.
But beyond legal systems, legacies are also very often built on sheer personal mythos. Take Richard the Lionheart. While he's literally dying from a gangrenous crossbow wound, Richard says to the boy who shot him, "Live on, and by my bounty behold the light of day." Instead of executing him, Richard forgave him. Now, whether or not the kid actually survived the king's incredibly angry followers later on, well, that's a different story. But Richard knew exactly how to forge a legend. He understood that mercy, deployed in just the right moment, creates a legacy far more enduring than cruelty ever could.
Then, of course, there are the legacies that are forged in just totally impossible victories. Look at Henry V at the Battle of Agincourt. His men were absolutely exhausted, they were sick with dysentery, and they were outnumbered 5-1 by the French army. 5-1. But Henry used the environment to his advantage. He used this heavy, thick mud that completely bogged down the French cavalry, and he combined that with English longbows and pointed wooden stakes. It was an absolute tactical masterclass. It elevated English military prestige to this mythic status, solidifying a legacy so huge that Shakespeare would be writing plays about it centuries later.
But here's the catch. Legacies are inherently fragile if the entire system relies purely on the person sitting on the throne. Because of a weak and mentally unstable King Henry VI, the Great Plantagenet dynasty literally tore itself apart in a massive civil war between the houses of Lancaster and York. By 1483, all of this chaos culminated in the ruthless Richard III seizing the throne. But, the real beauty of the British system was that the architecture of the monarchy itself actually survived the horrific, bloody flaws of the men who briefly wielded its power.
Which finally brings us to a really provocative question to end on. And I want you to just think about this as we wrap up today's explainer. Are the truest, most enduring legacies built of immovable stone, like the Great Pyramid standing silently out there in the desert? Or are they built of adaptable systems, like the British monarchy, which evolved through bloody civil wars, terrible plagues, and the rise of parliaments to survive for over 1,000 years? It's just such a fascinating lens through which to view history. Thank you so much for joining me today. Keep asking great questions, and I will see you next time.